I am a human being and I killed human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.
In South Africa, 83 people are murdered every day. That's 83 families shattered, 83 stories that are really told. Welcome back to Profiler Africa. My name is Paul Llewellyn, and it's a chilly one in South Africa, but we have got a hot episode for you tonight to keep you warm. Grab a cup of coffee and settle in, because we've got a really great discussion for you tonight. Today, we're shifting from individual killers and farm murders to one of the most chilling chapters of domestic terror in our country's history, the Boeramag, a violent white supremacist militia with plans to ignite a race war, assassinate Nelson Mandela, and bring South Africa to its knees. Joining us once again, he's been with us on the podcast previously before we went all video, is retired Colonel Tolly Vreugdenburg. Really one of my favorite episodes, which is why I say you're in for an absolute treat tonight. He is, of course, the man who led the SAPS counterterrorism unit that cracked the Boeramag case wide open. Tolly's experience spans decades hunting down some of the deadliest criminals in South Africa, and tonight he takes us inside the brutal plot that nearly tore the nation apart. Before I hand over to Gerard to welcome Tolly, if you're new here, hit subscribe, smash the notification bell, and join the Profiler Africa family. We drop no fluff crime stories done in what we like to think is our evolvingly unique style. If you want early access and exclusive extras, consider becoming a YouTube member or support us on Patreon. All the links are on the page, so please do that. Okay, and with that said, Gerard, good evening. How are you doing? Are you keeping warm tonight?
I am. I took off my little beanie, but I'm trying to keep warm, yeah.
Now, this week, you had the distinct honor in one of your many roles as MC, and I gather that we're not referring to the rapping kind of MC, but more the hosting a lovely book launch version of MC. Yeah, and maybe that's a good way for us to lead into tonight's guest. So I'm going to hand over to you. Tell us a little bit about where you were, first of all, and then introduce our amazing guest tonight.
Yeah, so I think if you watched last week's episode, right at the end, I held up a book, The High Treason Club, and said that I was going to be emceeing the book launch. Would have been last week, Wednesday. So it was the day after our last week's show. And that's what I did in Brooklyn and Pretoria. And it was a massive turnout, I have to say. They actually couldn't host it in the exclusive books itself. It was sort of in a more of an open area. And I think there was easily 100 more people to come and hear what Tolly, our guest tonight, and Karen, who actually wrote the book, had to say in their experiences of involvements in those cases, obviously from different perspectives. Tolly from the investigation and trial perspective. Karen was a journalist who came in at some point to cover the story, and then got to know, a lot of the actual members of the prosecution team, police included, but also got to know quite a few of the accused people and their families quite well. So it's a very nice, unique perspective on, not just this is what happened, but sort of the backstory, as I always like to say it, which I always find just as fascinating as the front story, actually.
Profiler fans, were Profiler fans in attendance? Anyone?
Yeah, well, yes, they were. Penguin was very kind, because they not only had Tolly, the book that Tolly contributed to and Corin wrote, but they also had some of my books there. And so, yes, there were some people who came to get their books signed. I really appreciated that. And a lot of people that I just knew from the police. I think there were so many ex-cops, current cops, intelligence people, etc. Like I said at the book launch, if somebody had to plant a bomb there, you would have taken out probably half the country's capacity to investigate terrorism cases. So it was kind of like a mini reunion, and it was nice to see so many people that were mentioned in the book were actually in attendance. So I actually got my copy of the book, which Corin had signed when she sent it to me, signed by, Advocate Fook, who was one of the prosecutors, Louis Bester, who was, Tolly's line manager, and a whole bunch of other people that just were there. So that was quite fun.
Well, and maybe we should, then let's bring Tolly into the conversation. I think we got there. Good evening, Tolly.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to join you. And it's a nice night.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm sure it will be. Everybody loved our last podcast, so I have no doubts that it's going to be a good one too.
Yeah, a real deep dive. I mean, what I'm excited about is even Gerard was saying the other day that, we've covered this case before, but recently, he's learnt aspects of the story that even he wasn't aware of previously. So much is there to the tale of the Boeremark. So, a real deep dive tonight. Let's jump into it. Gerard, where are we going to start?
Great. Let's start what we always do, which is like me trying to figure out where we first met each other. And I think it was probably not very long after I joined SAPS, because if I recall correctly at the time, amongst your various responsibilities for Limpopo province, you were the provincial coordinator for serial murder investigations, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct, yes. I was at that time appointed as the provincial coordinator, yes.
And by that time, you'd worked on quite a few serial murders.
Yes, so by then already solved the Lovers Lane killer, the David Mbengwa case in Thohoyandou. We also solved the RDP killer as well as the Hospital View killer in the Mokopane area. And the stage that you and I met, we had quite a spate of Muti killings there. And you visited me to come to try to understand the concept of Muti killings and see if there's a correlation between Muti killings and serial killings. And I think we sorted it out that time there.
Yeah, and then as you'll see today, this our involvement in investigations continued even a little role in this particular case that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, well, I used the training that I received from Mickey and yourself, and I applied it to the rest of my career. After my initial psychological motivated crimes course, I applied the principles of your training into my career and used it very successful. We'll come to the part where you played a role in the Boeremark. You say it's a small role. For me, your advice was a breakthrough in my investigation. That's how much I honor that advice.
And of course, you were, I think, one of the first people that Mickey trained after she had done some other training, or received some training herself, I think.
Yeah, so we were the second course. The first one was the one that Robert Ressler was involved in. The second course was Piet Bielefeld, Alan Alford, the guys from the Phoenix serial killing, and some of those guys and myself was on the second set of training. So way in 96, 97, around that years. Yes.
Yeah. Right at the beginning, yeah. And yes, I mean, some of the cases you mentioned a moment ago, those serials, I think some of them were covered in Mickey's book, or some of Mickey's books also.
Yes, all of them were covered there. In Catch Me a Killer, as well as Strangers on the Street, David Mbengwa is mentioned there. The Thohoyandou Lovers Lane, where at that stage, we think we broke a world record by solving the case within 7 days since putting a team together and start working on the case. And we held that record for a long time, and that record was broken by your previous guest, Saki Lawrence, who was one of my members at murder robbery in the Bushveld area. So I'm glad that I could hand over that torch to him. He's a deserving recipient of that torch.
Yeah, and just like a great bunch of people, even some of the names you mentioned who attended your course, Alan Alford, Piet Bielefeld. I mean, most people probably have heard of Piet Bielefeld. Alan Alford was a legend down in the Durban Murder and Robbery Unit. So a lot of great people.
Yeah, Big Bill. It is unfortunate one of the ladies that was also on course of us, Rihanna Stein, was killed this weekend by gender-based violence. That was very sad for us within that course group that still keep contact with each other. Yes.
Yeah, and sadly, that's also the daughter of a very well-known murder and robbery detective from Brixton Murder and Robbery. So obviously, for his family, thoughts go out to them.
Yes, for sure. Our thoughts go out to them and to Rihanna's family. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, we did discuss this on the podcast previously, but just a little nutshell about your career, because did you always want to become a cop, and how did you end up where eventually you're the head of counterterrorism investigation for SAPS?
Well, I was born in a cop's house. My father was a cop. I grew up in the left-hand seat of a police van. He was in the beginning of his career in my life. He was stationed in rural areas, Lephalale, Stockport, Mara, all in the Limpopo province, the Northern Province. So for me, there was no other way of other career in my mind. My mother had the thought that maybe I must become a pharmacist because she wanted me to have that education. But luckily, my points was not, or my school marks was not enough for me to be allowed into the university. So I joined the police college in February of 1980. And that is, if you look at my CV, that's the only job I had. I was a policeman from February 1980 until the 30th of December of 2022, a 42-year and 10 months career in the police, where I went through the ranks from a constable to a full colonel, and had experienced everything in the police that is to be experienced. From after my basic training, I was a camp guard at Pretoria Central. I stood there in Bosman Street with HMK, hand machine carabine, that camp guard duties, drove the police van, worked in a charge office, became a learner, a detective, later did my qualifications and my studies, and then I was promoted to or commissioned to officer for the rank of lieutenant in 1992. Became a branch commander at Wombas Detective Branch, and in 1996 I was requested to open to start a murder robbery unit in the Bushveld that concentrated mostly on farm attacks and farm murders. In 2000, Gerald, and you must assist me there. Jackie Celebi decided to close down the murder robbery units. Now, we were one of the most successful murder robbery units and I can say it with proudness. On our farm attacks, farm murders, our solving rate was 95%, and our conviction rate in court was 100%. We never lost a case in court. So then by the powers to be close us down, I was transferred to a area office where I sat behind the empty desk. And on the fateful day in September of 2002, I received a call, and by the end of the next week, I was up to my head into the Boeremark case suddenly. And became involved in investigating of terrorism until the last day of my career in 2022.
And I mean, you've just covered, I mean, there were so many other cases. I mean, people, as I said, often know you for the Boeremark case and some of those serials. But just in the counterterrorism cases, I mean, there's so many other phenomenal ones. The Del Vecchio, where they murdered, which was an ISIS kind of inspired murder of a couple in KZN, to the Crusaders case in 2019. But I mean, I think the Boeremark is one that stands out for so many people, and I think is part of our cultural knowledge about crime. I think because the trial, as you know, as you'll get to in a moment, went on for so long. It wasn't a case that was quick, investigated, prosecuted, and forgotten. It stayed with us for such a long period of time.
It became a lifestyle for me. I was involved in that case for 10 years, 11 years on one case. So it's not many policemen that can say they were actively involved in a case for 10 years or 11 years. But I had the opportunity, but for me it was not a punishment. It was actually a privilege and a big learning experience that made it possible for me to, in later years afterwards, after the Boeremark case, address other threats to the security of the country. The one is the 2012 Mangaung attack attempted attack on the ANC elective conference, where we fought the attack 6 hours before it had taken place, and the whole also then the Muslim extremist cases in South Africa, like the Del Vecchio case where the Sanders couple disappeared, and we worked on that case, arrested the suspects. There was the Woolworths bombings in KZN, where we worked for a long time, and we successfully arrested them. The outcome of the case is a bit of a bad one, but there is movement again on that. But so yes, after I started the Boeremark, I completely concentrated on counterterrorism cases, and also got involved in various international groups and international panels for counterterrorism. That enabled me to actually on the budget of the state travel the world and see most of the continents, and also rub shoulders with the SO15 counterterrorism unit of Scotland Yard, of the FBI, with the Australian Federal Police, with the Japanese police, with the Brazilian police, all those guys that is actively involved in counterterrorism cases. And I can tell you, with all my visits to the foreign countries, they had very much respect for what we achieved on the Boeremark case, as well as the other terrorist cases what my section investigated in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, an impressive record, and I just hope it sort of continues into the future. It's always about succession planning, and that's my always anxiety, is that are we going to be able to groom the next generation to take over and continue when we retire or resign? So always anxiety.
Yes, that is so. Similar with you, the day you resigned, same with the day that I retired. The worry is there. What now? Who's left? Yes.
But let's jump into this case. So as I said, a lot of people just might know Boeremark by the name, but in a nutshell, who were they, and then kind of what did they end up doing that brought them to the police's attention?
The Boeremark was a right-wing extremist case, a group that whose main intention was to take over the country by means of an armed conflict and reinstate apartheid, reinstate a white government in South Africa, and that is it. That is what their plans was. There was different sections or factions in the group, and there's different stages. So the first part of the Boeremark was started in 2001 when Mike du Toit, the first leader of the Boeremark, started compiling a document, a manifest called Document 12. That was an attack plan that they wanted to use to overthrow the government by means of an armed conflict. In the plan, it was the plan that got the plan on his computer, as well as hard copies later on. He planned to take over army bases through the middle of South Africa, from Luatla through to Bloemfontein, through to the Mpumalanga area, to take over the army bases, arm themselves with the Defence Force armaments, and started attacking the country from the middle of South Africa, going north. Now it sounds like a ridiculous plan, but if you look at world history of terrorism and the revolutions, the Cuban Revolution was started by four. Che Guevara and the two brothers. The French Revolution was started by two, Robespierre and two other people. So one or two people can start a revolution, and they can succeed in the revolution and overthrow the government of any country by a popular uprising. And that is what these guys wanted to do. They wanted to use the principle of popular uprising. Once they started with the attack, they would have been joined by other people with the same way of thinking as them, and they eventually form a big force and succeed in their plan. So the plan itself was yes.
But I know you're probably going to get to this, but I mean, they also blended it with their view of the Bible, and also, of course, Sino van Rensburg, that sort of that South African version of Nostradamus. and their prophecies. So it was a bit of like, let's hope the world, the people stand up, but it was also resting on this belief that there's actually a spiritual stroke prophecy behind what they're doing, which will help make it work.
Yeah, there was two things that influenced them. The first one was religion. The religion is Israel Vision religion that they have. That is a religion that started in the Elizabethan area way back, where they see that the white race is a supreme race, and the Boers are the and I don't say the whites in South Africa, I say the Boers, because that's how they define themselves. The Boers are the chosen race of God, and that must leave the country, or must own South Africa. And then next to their Bible was the visions of Sine van Rensburg. Sine van Rensburg was a person that lived during the Anglo-Boer War and died in 1922. Yeah, they have recorded about 700 of his so-called visions. That he says he called himself a prophet of God, and he said he had the privilege of being able to speak to God. But looking at Siner itself, and not talking down about him, he was an illiterate person that could only read his Bible. He could not write. So every vision that he had was written down by his daughter, or later on by a person by the name of Boy Moesman, in Dutch, or the kind of Afrikaans that was used by the turn of the previous century. The problem I have with that, and most of the people that have with that, is what he said and was written down, and what is interpreted today as his visions is three complete different things. That is just different things. You cannot. There's no way. It's like the Nostradamus predictions. Also, you have to, and even if you look at the Book of Revelations in the Bible, you really have to look behind lots of stuff, and you cannot just interpret it to fit your own pocket. And that's what happens in South Africa with Sine van Rensburg's so-called visions. That the interpretation of that is fitting the glove of the person that wants to execute it. I can give you one example, a very short example, unrelated to the Boerenmacht. There's a vision that was written down that it says, "I see a woman with blue eyes standing up." That is it. That was it. So to interpret it, the people that try to interpret it say, no, that must be a woman with blue eyes that is standing up and became a leader. But he didn't put a date to it. He had this vision in 1904. That was penned down in 1904. So since 1904, if you look at the world, and you cannot a person with receiving visions from God, prophecies from God, is not limited to your country. It's limited to whatever God created. So from 1904 until today, how many women with blue eyes became leaders in the world? I can count at least 6. Golda Meir, Evita Peron, Margaret Thatcher in South Africa, also the two Helen Ziller and Helen Suzan. So there is. So which one actually speaking about them? So Sine van Rensburg spoke about a bucket of blood that will turn over, and the blood will run down the street. He also, one of the visions said he saw a coffin going down into a grave of young boys jumping out of the grave as a guys, and fire all over the place. Now they interpreted that as the day that a very popular black leader is going to die, and then the black will start with a genocide or killing the whites in South Africa. Now, for the Boerenmacht, they were very strong believers in Sine van Rensburg visions, but for them, the visions didn't happen quickly enough. So they wanted to create it. That is where the problem came in. They wanted to create it. So when the first group, the Document 12 group, was arrested in April of 2002, before any bloodshed, anything happened, Um, the next group under the leadership of Tom Foster was created, and they planned Operation Popeye, where they did take document 12. They made a smaller version of it, where they planned to explode 18 car bombs on the 13th of September 2002 in the Gauteng, Johannesburg, Pretoria area. They built the bombs. They rented the vehicles. Actually, where we had the launch the other night there by Brooklyn, some of those vehicles were parked in the basement right under the place where we were sitting there. So they rented 18 car vehicles at Avis at Oor Tambo Airport. They came together the night of the 12th of September 2002 here at the farm close to my house, the Kopia Lane. And then they, unfortunately, it depends on which side of the one you sit, only 27 people joined them. But in the group that was there was the 18 car bombs with the explosives. There was a huge amount of ammunition, a huge amount of firearms. Mostly of the firearms was military firearms, because a big group of these people were youngsters that belonged to the then existing SANDF commandos, the local commandos that every town had, and they had access to those items. So it was our force and our ones, military weapons, military equipment, military uniforms that they had, military radios that they had. So the group left the morning of the 13th of September. They left the farm here between Modimolle and Bella Bella on their way to Gauteng to execute the plan at 3 o'clock the afternoon on the Friday. On the way there was some intervention, and they got scared, and they disbanded the group and they fled. Some of them fled to Lichtenburg, and the rest went back to their houses. The Leeds Pretorius, that was part of the leadership of and the leader of the Potgietersrus cell, had made available his truck, a medical truck that is known as the Lanong truck, that was found on the Saturday, the 15th. The 14th found in Lichtenburg at the factory parking area. And when the truck was opened, they found a huge amount of ammunition there, medical equipment, AK-47, some detonators, some boosters that he used in explosives. And Leeds himself was arrested by the Sunday night in Rustenburg and detained. That is the long truck, what you can see there, and it is in the parking lot of the factory. And you can see all the equipment in front of is medical as well as military ammunition and military equipment that's laying there. There's night sights, military night sights, various a huge amount of ammunition, military ammunition that was found there, and also one AK-47. Yes.
What, did they just forget it there? I mean, that's a lot of valuable equipment if you're thinking of planning to continue with your revolutionary activities. Why was that left there and discovered?
The truck itself is of a huge value. The truck is a mobile clinic that was used in the Potgietersrus area by the Pretorius family. There's two doctors, the father and the son as doctors. They used it at the mines to test on the miners for tuberculosis, and so that's a huge, very expensive equipment inside that truck. So, but that is a mobile clinic for treating patients during the war. And in China, for instance, visions say there's one of the visions say that a person with a brown jacket will address them at Lichtenburg. So the families, the wives of the Boeremark guys that came together on the farm here on the 12th. They were already at Lichtenburg at the camping ground there. And when the men disbanded their convoy and their plans here in Bella Bella, the Pretorius family fled to Lichtenburg, to the campsite where the women were waiting. But that truck was too big to enter through a bridge, underneath the bridge. And that's why they left it there in the middle of the parking lot. And the prayer was that they said that it will close, God will close the policeman's eyes and will not see it. But that happened. So that didn't happen. So that Louis Pretorius, my colleague in Northwest, recovered the truck by the Saturday, and that was a huge thing for a breakthrough in the case itself. So getting that is just up to stage 1 and 2, the Popeye, the document 12 and the Popeye part. Let me just go back to document 12's plan.
Can I just jump in here quickly, Tolly?
Yes, please.
I just want to just drop in a couple of the comments here from folks online, just kind of acknowledge and say hi to everyone. And then we'll carry on. I also want to just drop in some of your slides as well. We've got an incredible presentation that we've that you shared with us, so we can also maybe just go back and introduce some of the characters so that folks know exactly, can put some names to the face or faces to the names. First of all, let's say hi to Narana. I actually set an alarm to watch you guys live again tonight. Great show. Thank you very much. We have Charles. He went to the release of the book event at Brooklyn. All last week. Was good to be in the presence of all the role players and see Colonel Labuschagne interviewing. Busy eating the book up like crazy. And then we had, well, the author herself. Thanks for being there, Charles. So hi, Karen. Glad to. So Karen is watching. Appreciate it. Thank you for the high praise of the book, Gerard. Let me bring that up. And for emceeing. Love that I get to sit back and watch you and Tolly talk about the case tonight. Then we've got our good friend Marius is with us as well tonight. His wife Renee was part of the investigation task team under Colonel Bester. Let's just do a couple more before we carry on. We've got Gillian, who covered a large part of the trial for SABC. Definitely one of the most fascinating trials in SA history. Great to see Tolly after so many years.
Glad to see you again. It's many years, 2 decades since I last saw you.
Yes, he says, great to see you, Tolly, after so many years as well. And then let's take a question. Was there a catalyst from starting this planning at the time they did, as opposed to having it coincide with the 1994 elections? And then I'll jump into the slides so we can carry on with the story here.
So they called it the catalyst for this was they called it D-Day. That was a day that when say in the first phase of the document 12 phase, they would have taken over the army bases and start with the attack from the south, and the popular uprising would have started. Part of that plan, and that's what I want to come back just before now, is it sounds like a ludicrous plan. It sounds like a stupid plan. They wanted to use the SANDF's armament, cannons, tanks, etc., by shooting into the population up north. After all the white people have joined them, there will be only people of color left in front of them. Shooting at them, allow them to flee north. In the process, they wanted to drive out all the black people to Zimbabwe, and they wanted to put all the people of Indian descent on trains to Durban and put them on boats and send them back to India. Now, it is jokeable. It's a plan that you can laugh about. But if you sit down and you think about the plan, in the failure to execute a stupid plan like that, how many people would have been killed? That is unfortunately the reality of that. Everybody, and these guys were not the old right-wing. There's a person speaking about the 94 explosion. The 94 right-wing was the brandy and coke right-wing. Really brandy and coke and getting a brandy carriage. These guys were highly religious. None of them drink. Highly led by the Sinapharensis prophecies. So they were serious in their plans. Their plans was doomed to fail, but in the process of failing, thousands and thousands of people would have been killed if they had started. If we didn't prevent every one of the catalysts to start to kick in.
But still, I think the question was also why at that point in 2001, 2002 made them think this is now the time to do what they wanted to do.
That was a time, also in Jennifer Rensburg's book, they're speaking about the old Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And that was a time that Mugabe was start expropriating the farmers in Zimbabwe from their farms, chasing them away. So they saw that as a sign of the time. The time is now right. Mugabe's actions in Zimbabwe was part of Sisina van Rensburg's vision that they put together and say that is why the timing was exactly during that time.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Paul, you wanted to jump into some.
Yeah,
role
I'm
players.
gonna jump into some of the slides, and then maybe we can take it from there, gentlemen.
Oops, your
Okay.
voice is gone, Paul. Yeah.
So this is a photo
Sorry about
from this is a photo from the court itself. Right in front here is Mike de Tooy, the leader of the first phase of the Boerenmag. He's the author of Document 12. Next to him is his brother Andre, who was a policeman previously, and later on my daughter's teacher here at Wombas High School. At his back with the beard is Tom Foster. He's the leader of the second phase, the Popeye phase, and the guy who was turning his face back away from us is Herman van Rooyen. He was the leader of the last phase when the creator Night of the Long Knives. On the left is some of the defense attorneys, and in the background there's some of the other accused. This is Tom Foster walking down with one of his Bibles, a version of his Bibles. As you can see there, he's in leg chains, also in a belly chain. That was after he attempted to escape from the court itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's also Tom Foster. You can see the belly chain around his belly there, cuffed to his hands and to his body. And on the right is the late advocate Prinsloo. He was and his wife at the back, Louisa. It's the two advocates that defended accused 1, 2, and 3, as well as 11. That was Tom Foster.
Okay.
So that is a book. That is a long track we discussed that belonged to the Pretorius brothers, the family. That was supposed to be used as a mobile clinic for the mines. But from information that I received, and that is interesting because these guys had commercial detonators that they used to detonate the bombs. And one of my formers, or one of my witnesses at the mine said that Johan Pretorius, the younger doctor that operated this truck, once a miner comes to him and he did the x-ray from his chest and he see there was TB, signs of TB, he told the guy, go back, bring me some detonators from the mine next week, and then I'll give you a certificate that is clear, that say you are TB3. And that's how he managed to get his hands on commercial detonators, also commercial boosters that was used in the bombs.
Wow. Okay. Sure. I didn't know that. So basically, we've got a situation where it's early 2000s. These guys feel that they're seeing what's going on in Zimbabwe with the farm that's been taken over. They feel Sina van Rensburg's prophecies are coming true. They try to get this group of support from throughout the country, from the commando people to whoever else is interested. They kind of start to plan things, and they get the vehicles, they get the explosives, they're going to bomb certain places. The police are onto them. I think the intelligence services kind of picked up what they're up to. They're kind of caught, and they kind of then bombshell, and that's when the remaining people go on to phase 2, which I think you said was called Popeye. I mean, why on earth Popeye? I'd love to know. So kind of tell us about the next phase. Yeah.
Okay, so Popeye was the second phase. Popeye ended when the long track was found. Why they call it Popeye, up to now, nobody could tell me. But that on that slide, you can see some of the targets that would have been car bombs would have been parked in front of. So if you look at these Pocock, the officers, the Reserve Bank, in verenigings at the place where Eskom's head office is situated, the ANC Lutule House, certain police stations, airport, etc. All those was part of it, but that's not all the targets. The target list was 18 different car bombs that was supposed to be parked with, and everything was in preparation. So the end of Popeye was when they disbanded here at Bella Bella on the morning of the 13th, and they fled all over the country. As I said, the Lanong and the Pretorius family fled to Lichtenburg. Some of the others fled to the Free State. Henk van Zyl and Dirk Hanekom fled to the Free State. The Bella Bella guys went back to their farms, and that's where on the 16th of September, my involvement, I became involved in the case by chance. When we found out who the Bella Bella guys was that was involved in this plan of the 13th.
Because you knew, as you said, you mentioned it briefly now. I mean, you knew a lot of these guys. These were like teachers of your children, local doctors. This was not strange. These people weren't strangers to you.
My area of responsibility for the murder robbery unit is very big. It started close to Marble Hall in the east. It ended on the Botswana border in the west. It started from a Carousel casino in the south, ended just south of Polokwane in the north. So Potgietersrus, all those areas the whole area was Thabazimbi, all that was included in my area. And during my time at murder robbery with the farm attacks, I worked closely with the local commandos. In Bella Bella, Herman van Rooyen, who was accused number 18, was the leader of the reaction force at the commandos, who worked with me on farm attack crime scenes. In Late Pretorius was in Potgietersrus. He was the doctor. He had his own hospital there. The only private hospital in Potgietersrus was his hospital, his private hospital there. He treated lots of policemen there. He's well known in that area. So was the rest of them. Laurens du Plessis, that was involved in Thabazimbi, is a very well known, very rich farmer in the Thabazimbi area. All of them I know very well. Going back to personally at the school that my children went, the high school is accused number 18 van Rooyen's mother-in-law was a teacher there. Accused number 17, his wife was a teacher there. Some of the younger guys' girlfriends and family members went with my children to the same school, so we lived among them and we knew them personally very well. Accused number 18's brothers or sister-in-law was also a teacher there, and she was my son's athletic coach. She took him to the South African Championships with his athletic talent. That's how intertwined we were with the accused here, and still is. We're still staying here in Bella Bella, and they are also still in the same town as we are.
What was that like? Because I mean, we typically as cops, we don't even know who the victims are. We typically don't. We've never met them before they died. We don't know the suspects. So that must have been such a weird situation. And how did that impact upon you and your family?
The impact on there's two sides to it. The impact on the family was immense. Remember we're talking about a teenager girl, a girl that is, you have teenage girls, you know how difficult they are. And suddenly she had to be restricted and be protected. Because her life, as personally, she was mentioned as to be a target to punish me. There was plans to kidnap her, rape her, and just to punish me for betraying the Boer folk. My younger kids was without their father for 10 years. But when my son was in grade 2, when I left our home, he matriculated the day during the time the case was finalized. So he grew up without me. So yeah, that is the impact on the family. Just another joke. We also had a launch in Hoedspruit on Friday, and the lady that emceed there read the book, And when I took my wife, you met my wife, I took my wife with me to Hoedspruit, and she was the most glad person, or the person she was the most glad to see was my wife. She said when we read the book, she thought she left me, because any other woman would have left her husband if he leave her alone or for 10 years. But no, that is on the other side of the coin is, because I worked with the people, and I grew up in the Bushveld, and I know how the people's minds work here. That made it easy for me to work on the case and to think like they think. And it made it much easier for me to, and I think that's also the reason why I was then eventually asked to take over the investigation, as lead investigating of the case, because of my personal understanding of what our suspects is. You and Nikki have taught me, you must understand your suspect before you hunt him. So I applied that. I understand my suspects. I know what they were thinking. That's that, and then I hunted them.
I mean, it makes me think of that, and I said this during the launch last week on page 9 of Karen's book, where she quotes, and it stuck out for me because I really can relate to this. You may be a coup plotter, but most of the time you're just a person. And it's important to understand that person, just like what you said, to effectively know how to investigate them, how to trace them, to just get into their minds, really. So, yeah.
Yes, that is so.
I'm going to jump in. We've actually got a question from Karen here, and we've got a few questions that are around a similar topic here, and I'll just drop it up here. So from Karen, Gerard, from a psychology perspective, is there anything in particular that makes an individual or several individuals susceptible to joining a group with such radical ideals like the Boeremag?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I don't know if I can give you the best answer, but I think if you look at history, young people are often looking for something, feeling disaffected, find somebody that relates to them in some ways. But also think in this case, a lot of these people, they grew up in this kind of mindset and environment. So for them, they were socialized into it. Now, that's very different to other people, like I think it's Stefans Coetzee, who we've spoken about before, who also planted bombs in the 90s. And he was not raised as a sort of a right winger, so to speak, with these strong religious views. But later on in his life, a friend of his dad's friend, who his own father was an alcoholic and not really around after a certain point. So his friend's dad became the substitute dad, and he was into these things. So I think it's just often it can be a case of a person who's just really a lost soul. But I think a lot of these people, this is the kind of they grew up into this. I mean, like you saw, Let's Pretorius and how many of his kids were involved in this. One later turned away. Kobus turned away from these issues. So I think for a lot of people, it was just kind of like how you're raised and maybe a twist on some of the existing beliefs and attitudes you had. And it wasn't so much of a big jump to get you over the next little hurdle because you maybe had already 80% of the mindset there. I don't know, Tole, I mean, as you work with these people, then
yes, if you look at exactly, if you look at the Pretorius family, the father and the 3 sons, all 4 of them were arrested, all 4 were involved. The middle son, Kobus, broke away from the family. After he came into contact with people that thinking otherwise than he was brought up to think. He was brought up in a house with a right-wing thought that everything. If you go into that house, when you search the house, you will see in every wherever you see the field clear, you see all the stuff that is there, but that prompts a person to be right-wing orientated. And once Kobus realized that he was brainwashed from birth, he broke away, and he's still not part of his real family. He adopted another family, and he's part of another family. He doesn't want to have anything to do with his own family. And he's one, like Gerard pointed out, Stefans, he's one of the few success stories of de-radicalization out of the right wing into a normal life after seeing the light and understanding that not everybody is like they were brought up or they were taught or they were led to believe.
Oh, Paul, now you're muted. At least it's not me.
Hey, this is the. I hope everyone watching realizes that I'm also pressing. I do all the button pushing around here. I know I seem to have the ongoing troubles with my sound lately, but I apologize for that, guys. I'm just going to bring up a question just on this topic, just before we move on from data tangles, and say thank you for the super sticker and the contribution to the cause. But his question is: in the age of the internet, would it be easier for people such as the Boeremark to have an easier time influencing potential recruits, or is it a case of people finding what they want to find?
Well, the Boeremark had to organize meetings and drive and fly to meetings all over the country. I think we identified about 500 meetings that they attended and spoke and tried to recruit people at. Today, if once you finish off with this, and you can go onto any of the social platforms, and I think within 2 or 3 minutes you'll find at least 50 right-wing groups that is ready to recruit you. That is ready to recruit you, and we know by the social media how easy it is to recruit you. That is not only right-wing groups. If you look at the Islamic extremism, in the extremist group, they are out there. If you the IS, Islamic State, is the first one that used the social media as a recruiting tool, and very successful. So much so that I had to take off a 15-year-old girl from a plane in Cape Town that was on social media, married to an IS fighter, and was on her way to Syria to join him in Raqqa. She never saw him, but she was recruited. She was brainwashed. She was radicalized, all on social media. So the very, very, very dangerous thing is social media, especially in the hands of the wrong people. And if you look at the world of terrorism, that is a dangerous weapon. If I don't know how many people does remember the Baden-Meinhof gang way back in the 70s. They were a very small group that caused lots of trouble. If they had access to social media, they would have been unstoppable, because their ways and means of thinking was very popular at that stage.
Okay. Gerard,
should we jump into the next phase? Because there's still quite a lot of the story to tell.
So this is a detonator that is usually used in mines, especially in the mines up in northern Potgietersrus area, the platinum mines. You insert it in the booster and put the currency with a battery through it, and it explodes. That was what we found at one of the scenes. That is the AK-47 that was found in the Lanong truck. One thing that was strange to me, we found lots of ammunition, but we never found a single AK-47 round. So I don't know what, but that was, yeah. So that is also a commercial booster. Now that previous detonator you saw, the copper or the silver one, is inserted inside into this booster for explosives. And then this booster is inserted into the explosives, the ANFO, ammonium nitrate. And once it is detonated, there's a chain reaction between the difference, and the bomb explodes. So this is one of the parts. Now this is an interesting thing. This is Oudel Roon. That is the Boeremark. And if you look at the book that Karen authored, that is also the front page of our book. But that's Oudel Roon. It's a Nordic sign. It looks very familiar. You see the swastika of Hitler. It is from the same alphabet as Hitler's swastika. That means, the meaning of this is my inheritance. The ground is mine. The land is mine. These are stickers that would have been sticked onto the. Remember, I said they would have taken over army vehicles, defense force vehicles, and used them. So, but who would have been reacted to them? Also army vehicles. So they would have stick this on the side of their vehicles, so they can distinguish who's the friend and who's the foe. So if your Casper or your tank that you have stolen was not had one of these stickers on them, they shoot you out. But that is why it was there.
Sure.
So there's that part is so some of the ammunition you can see is military issued ammunition. The bags in front is military ammunition. In the middle down at the bottom there's a night sight. The one that looked like a night sight. It's a night sight, the military issued night sight. And the rest is all different kind of ammunition that was found in the long track there. So let's go over to this part of the phase, the last phase of the Boeremark. So on the 16th of September, the 15th, they had a meeting at Lichtenburg where they had a prayer meeting there, and they returned back to their houses. The Bella Bella group returned back to Bella Bella, and they slept over at Herman van Rooyen's farm. The farm's name is Alival. Yeah, just about 15 km out of Bella Bella. And then they saw on the television news that night that the long track was found in Lichtenburg. They became worried. So they prepare themselves there at the house. They draw up a guard list, and they was just there. They were suspecting that the police is gonna pounce on them. And they were correct. So during the night of the 15th, the Pretorius brothers arrived there at the house at the farm. Kobus, Johan, and Wilhelm arrived at the farm. The next morning, very early, they heard somebody coming up to the road, and they saw it was the police. They jumped on their vehicles and they disappeared into the country. For us at that stage, we didn't know who it was or where do they went. It was actually the police, but it was the group that pounced on the Van Rooyen house that morning of the 16th of September. Was a group of crime intelligence members and 2 or 3 organized crime members of Polokwane that went to the house. The reason why they went to the house up to today, I could not establish. But I was phoned later the afternoon on that Monday by Louis Bester and asked to send somebody to the farm there to see what was going on there, because he also got knowledge there, but there was operation by crime intelligence, but he didn't know what's going on there. So at that stage, my office was in Modimolle, Nystrom, 30 km from my house, and this is just past my house. So I decided not to send somebody, but to drive to the farm. Arriving at the Van Rooyen's house there at Alival, there lots of stuff happened. I was not briefed by the intelligence people, but eventually, when I left his house and I visited another crime scene in this close area where I found Johan Pretorius' Jetta with also ammunition and certain documents in it, I was driving home, and while I was driving back to Bella Bella from the farm, and that's going back to what I told you, Gerard, I know the people of the area. I know that if Herman van Rooyen was involved in anything, his relationships within the commando and where he worked, there's one person that must be involved. And I drove past that guy's farm, we call him Blackie, Johan Swart. And just by the instinct, I turned into his farm. And usually a farmhouse is open. You can go in there. You can knock, and the door is open. You can walk in. That day, and I know Blackie very well. I stopped there and the house was closed. Everything was locked. I had to knock 3 or 4 times before he opened the door. And out of character, he was very aggressive towards me. And so that also rang a bell, said something to him. And I asked him, my words to him is, what did you and Van Rooyen do? And he said nothing. He was very aggressive. I said, listen, you guys, and I use a few swear words, so I will not repeat here. You did that, but you're going to be arrested. You better come talk to me. Otherwise, you're going to be locked up. And I left the farm. I went back to my house, next day to the office. A few days later, the same blackie phoned me and arranged a meeting with me and told me the story of how they plan to place and park 18 cars with bombs in it in Gauteng. And he was part of the group that rented the vehicles at the OR Tambo airport. And he met up with the group here at Bella Bella when they disbanded. But he gave me the whole story of what Operation Popeye would have been. He even named the operation, it was well known to be Operation Popeye. And he gave me most of the role players' names that he knew, especially the Bella Bella cell, the group of the Bella Bella people that was involved in it. So, to me, it sounded like a fairy tale. How would a group of local guys that most of them know personally very well do something like that, and I would have no knowledge of it? Unbeknown to me, they did include me in their plans, but they did not tell me about it. I would have become the Minister of Police in the new government, so not by choice, by force.
Oh, really?
But,
oh, wow.
Yeah. But leave it as it is. I wouldn't have taken up that post in any case. But a joke aside. So that afternoon, after I spoke to Black, and I asked him now who's missing, what's going on. I see his biggest worry is that the Verrooyen brothers is missing, and what he saw on the television during the news on the Sunday, he saw the truck being offloaded, but he didn't see the bombs and the explosives on the television. His biggest worry is Van Rooyen Herman and his brother Alan is not on the farm, and he did not see the explosives, so he's worried what's going to happen now, what's going to happen next. So I sent him away. I said, please go get as much information as you can for me, and we'll keep contact. I found Louis Bester. I told him about this information, and Louis asked me in a very serious voice, please, when can you meet? When can you meet? I said, oh, you can come to Bella Bella. I'm driving now to Bella Bella, and it was a very short drive, but he was from Pretoria to Bella Bella as quickly as I was from Modimolle to Bella Bella. And he came with a senior crime intelligence officer as well as a local one. And I related the story that Blackie told me to them. And while I was speaking to them, I could see their eyes were going bigger and bigger and bigger, and the worries was on their faces. And then eventually they told me, yes, that is so. That is what is expected. But now we've got a problem. There's a group missing, and there's bombs, explosives missing. And they asked me Louis asked me to work on Blackie and to see what more can I get. He didn't give me not at all the whole picture of what was going on, but I had enough to work on with Blackie. Just looking for explosives and bombs, it is enough for me to start active investigation. So that same night, I asked Blackie where did the group disband, where did they came together, and they split up, and 4 o'clock in the morning, Blackie, Vickers Hartung, our explosive expert, and I went to the farm in the darkness, and went to the farm. We took an explosive dog with us, and he showed us a place where they stopped the trucks and they offloaded and reloaded everything. And we took out the explosive dog, and he immediately reacted. He went, as the explosive dog lay down immediately on his tummy. We could find nothing there. Although it was dark, we could see nothing there, but we could clearly see there was explosives. To cut to what comes, so there was different searches, and Blackie also took me to a place in next to Alexandra in Johannesburg, where all 18 cars would have been parked, and all the bombs would have been placed in the cars, and from there on they would have been dispersed into Gauteng. That's in Mulberry State in Lombardy East. We arranged for surveillance on that house by crime intelligence on that warehouse. We came back at one afternoon or late afternoon. Louis Bester phoned me. I said he's on his way with information. I must meet him. He arrived here at Bella with a group of his members as well as task force members, and they said Henk van Zyl, one of the accused, and Dirk Hanekom was arrested, and they explained to them and they directed them to them where the bombs was buried. So we drove on their directions, exactly the same place that Blackie has taken us, and I said that there's nothing here, so we couldn't find the bombs. Okay. The next morning, we called me to a meeting in Victoria, there by the crime intelligence officers in Silverton. We were still didn't sleep the whole night, and we were, as I also say in the book, Gerard, you know how our murder robbery guys dress: denims, high-tech boots, and a t-shirt. That is our official office clothes. The only time we wear a tie is when we're in court. Otherwise, that is the way of the work. So I arrived at that meeting there, and I saw in the meeting there's some familiar faces like Jackie Shalebe, Andre Preys, the second commander of the police, Raymond Lala, the commander of the crime intelligence. But in that meeting, we had a discussion, and I explained to them what I found. I explained to them that my worry is that there is still bombs outstanding that we have to recover, and that's a big concern to me. Salebi looked me in the eyes, and he said to me, "You must get those bombs." So yes, that was my next task was to get the bombs. I contacted back in Berber. I contacted Verrooyen's father, Gerald. I set up a meeting with him, and I asked, when we met, I asked him, "Where's your sons?" He said, "No, Erwan is gone, but Alan is his second-born son is on vacation." I said, "Well, they have knowledge where bombs is, and I want that bombs." He said, "Okay, let me get hold of Alan, and then we will speak." And I'm going over it very, very in a very fast way. It's very, that's actually a long story that one must read to follow it. But in short, is that Gerald, one morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, my phone rang, and answered. It was Gerald van Rooyen sitting with a lawyer with his son Alan, and said his son wants to point out the bombs to me, as well as explosives, but he wants not to be arrested. I said, "It's not in my hands, but let's arrange with the powers to be." After a few phone calls, we arranged that we'll meet the next morning on the farm. On the farm, I met Alan van Rooyen. He was a bit arrogant towards me, and I told him, "Listen, young man, there's two places for you to go. It's either to show me the bombs or go into the back of my vehicle of cuffs and go to the police cells." He decided on the latter, and he took me to a shed behind the farmhouse, where opened the shed, and inside the shed on the upper part of the store of the shed, we found 20 liters filled with ANFO, ammonium nitrate explosives.
And that's enough to blow up a hell of a lot of things.
That is a good amount of explosive. 21 times 20 liters of explosive of containers with ammonium nitrate. That exactly those. There they were standing. There's my Vikas Hatting, the explosive expert, was also with me. He was the one that discovered it. Now, as a side joke, I'm not trained in explosives. The moment he told me there's explosives, I said, "Okay, you see the guy that's standing the farthest from here? That's me." And I walked far as away as possible. I phoned Louis Bester and said, "That is what we found. you can so long start sending people to me. If you look at the top one there at the back, if the persons that's following the show, you see that white stuff coming out there. That's explosive. That is ammonium nitrate that is coming out of the top of that container there. So,
So that, I mean, that's enough to bring down numerous buildings.
Yes.
I'm just also checking our time. So if we jump forward, they then did actually set off a bunch of bombs so in other words, you've recovered this stuff, but there's still bombs that actually did go off.
Yeah. So during later in the month, so this group was on the run. The group was on the run was Van Rooyen, Aaron van Rooyen, Rudy Gous, Dion Kraus, and the three Pretorius brothers were on the run. And then eventually on the night of the 30th October, the bombs exploded in Soweto. There was 7 bombs exploding in Soweto at the railway tracks. One at the so sorry. Let's go back to the cylinder bombs. That is the bombs that we discovered later. Apart from those explosives itself, those explosives that we discovered there would have been placed into this cylinders, and this cylinders would have been placed inside the vehicles that has been parked in front of the targets and detonated there. So we tested the one in the front there, the red one. We tested it on the explosive controlled explosion, and it blew up a complete car with shrapnel found up to 2 kilometers away from the explosive scene. That is the timing devices that they used, and that is explosives that they used. So at the end of October, the bombs exploded in Soweto. This is the one at the Florida railway lines that exploded there. Between the lines, we found that timing device, a very, very primitive timing device, but very sophisticated in the way that it works, and that detonated the bomb. That for any layperson, that will be only a box of a wind-up clock, 2 batteries, a few wires. For me, as a detective, that's a treasure trove of evidence. You see that that blue piece of plastic, that is the one that causes, that is removed by the winding up clock, and that is completely the currency, and that causes the explosion. So later in the investigation, we found the masterpiece, and all the explosion scenes that we had, we recovered pieces of blue plastic. We fitted it, physical fitted in there, and that is one of that little piece of blue thing that you see there linked all the bombs together by means of physical fit by basic forensic work. That is basic forensic work. That is not very, very difficult to do that, but that is a very important. That's how important it is in connecting cases.
And basically those little pieces of blue plastic was put in between the 2 contact points, and then as the clock went off and wound down, it pulled that piece of plastic away, and the 2 contact points came in touch with each other and detonated the bomb, essentially completed the circuit. Yeah,
exactly. It completed the circuit and it detonated the bombs. Yes. Yeah. So that is
so all in all, how many bombs that actually went off across the country?
There was 7 in Soweto that exploded. One that exploded at the same night at Lamini at the mosque, just a few kilometers from there. Another one was disarmed at the petrol station close to these explosions. And on the next morning, one bomb exploded at a Buddhist temple in Bronkhorstspruit. A few weeks later, or a few days later, a bomb exploded at the Grand Central Airport, where the police air wing was, and then the last bomb exploded at the Ndavuma Bridge, the link between KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape there by Port Edward. That's where the last bomb exploded. Then this is the one where Claudia Mokone was killed. The only and luckily the only person that was killed in the bomb blast. This is the railway line between Midway and Lens. that they exploded the bomb, and the piece of the railway track was flung 550 meters through the shack roof, and there on the bed was laying Claudia, the piece of railway track decapitated. Her husband was sleeping next to her. He took the piece of railway track, took off his whole chin. He had to rebuild the chin. But on the other side, on the ground was sleeping 3 children, unarmed. Luckily, nothing happened to them. Luckily, they were unarmed. So there's the mosque in Morocco. The reason why they blow up the mosque is while they were driving around looking for targets, they saw a white lady driving a vehicle with a burqa on it. They followed her, and she was married to the Nigerian imam of the mosque, and that is why they targeted the mosque. Straightforward, because there's a white lady married to a black person that was staying in the mosque there. Yes. This is our Grand Central. The crime scene is inside the hangar there. The hangar, the only damage the hangar received was part of the roof was gone, but inside, as you can see, there was supposed to be at the back, there's supposed to be a wall. The whole wall was blown away. This chopper was severely damaged, as well as a fixed-wing aircraft on the left-hand side. Out of picture that was severely damaged. That's in the Vuma Bridge. They planted bombs at the foot of the bridge, but unfortunately, or fortunately for us, the timing was wrong. One of the wires went across the explosions, and the pylon, like this pylon, did not completely destroy it, because if you see there, next to the pylon, there's a piece of blue thing laying there. That is one of the bombs that did not explode. If that one exploded, it would have taken out the pylon completely, and the bridge would have fallen. So by miscalculating the wiring, some of the parts of the bomb that did not explode there. That's why the bridge went down. So they were on a run, and we were having lots of pressure on us. My team was running around. Sleep was a rare thing for us. So on the 10th of December 2002, through a crime intelligence operation, we managed to lower 2 of the suspects into an ambush. Lalem Pretorius and Rudy Gous. They in North Park in Pretoria. They were arrested by the Special Task Force. I arrived on scene, and just Gerard, let me just rewind to where I asked you for your assistance. Once I identified the bomber group and the group that was on the run, I can tell the audience that I after investigating the group, I took to Gerard a bunch of statements that describing their involvement, also the Jennifer Rensburg book, and that I asked him, my question to him is, who would be in this group, the soft people? Who would be the ones that falls the easiest? That I don't want to, not if when I arrest him, because I was sure I'm going to arrest him. When I'm arresting him, I didn't want to waste time on a person that's not going to speak to me. I want to go directly to the person that I know will crack, and I'll speak to me immediately. And he gave me 2 names, Dion Kraus and Rudy Gous. So the first arrest was on the night of the 10th, the Lalem Pretorius and Rudy Gous. So that night I took Rudy Gous, moved him a few meters to a tree, and we sit next to each other to the tree, and we start talking to each other. And once he went over to calling me Oom, and those of you that is Afrikaners will know that once you call a person Oom, you gain you respecting him. So he showed me a house in close by where Safe House is, as well as a possible hiding place for them in Port Edward. We flew the night. We flew down to Margate and went to the house in Port Edward. You couldn't find anybody there. When I arrived back in Pretoria that morning with the airplane, I was sent to this scene in Baffianspoort in Eastland, where the task force members arrested Herman van Rooyen and Dion Kraus. On that vehicle was a car bomb, complete. All that what you see there is explosives. A 365 kilogram car bomb that would have been placed 3 days later, parked in Marawastad. On top of it, what you don't see there was lots of bags of bolts and nuts and shrapnel that was to be used as shrapnel to give us to make as much as injuries as possible to them. But inside the vehicle there was 2 persons, Herman van Rooyen and Dion Kraus. One of the names Gerard gave me that as a person that will be so easily spoken to was Dion Kraus. We took them to my office. Sorry, let's go back to what we see there. There is the timing device, the bomb expert pulling out the detonator from the explosive itself. That piece of blue thing there is in his hand is a detonator as well as explosive cord. And this in the side of the bag, you see where the yellow plastic is coming. There's a timing device inside there. Also on that timing device, when we opened it later on, we found also the piece of blue plastic that we fitted to that previous photo that we was. But in any case, let's go back to that morning of the 11th. I spoke to Dion Kraus within a few seconds. I can say really a second, of course, by that time, I hadn't slept for a few nights. I was smoking 60 cigarettes a day. I hadn't eaten something. I had a long flight up and down from Margate to Pretoria. I don't. My temper was not that good, but I can say with all honesty, no violence was used, apart from speaking to me, telling him that you must better cooperate now. And he decided to cooperate with me. And he told me that the rest of the group is at the farm in the northern province. And he went on and to give you better information. See, in that same vehicle that we found the bomb and the viewer was arrested, there's a GPS, and on that GPS, the coordinates of the exact place where they are on the farm is there. I found a person at the scene, and they went onto the GPS. They gave us the coordinates. We put together a task force group of 1 Oryx, 3 BK helicopters, and 1 fixed wing, and we flew to that farm in the Marnitz, Baltimore area. We landed there, and we arrested 3 more suspects and the factory where they manufactured bombs, explosives. We found 2.5 tons, 2,500 kilograms of ammo there, various hand grenades, my own hand grenades. And we found this document that was just shown there. If you can bring it up again, that document was the plan of the 13th of December 2002. They would have had those 300 kilogram bombs parked in 4 places in Gauteng. One of the places they would have targets that have parked it is the Breer Street taxi rank. And if you remember, a few years ago, there was a gas line explosion in exactly the same street with huge damage. So if you now think back and you put the 300 kilograms of explosives on top of that gas line, what would have been the damage? They would have. We worked out.
I don't think people
What would have been the damage? Yeah.
300 kilograms is huge.
Yeah. If you go back to the history of South Africa, the Church Street bomb was only 56 kilograms. If you look at the Oklahoma bombing, that was quite a big bomb. Dr. McVeigh used exactly the same explosives, but Tim used, I think, it's 1,000 kilograms of explosive that took out the whole building. This would have, the 300 kilograms with the gas underneath it would have taken the whole area. We established, for research that we done later on, with guys from the disaster management said, at that scene at least we would have had 3,000 casualties, either dead or or severely injured. One of the bombs, that bakkie itself, that white Corsa would have been parked in Marabastad next to the taxi rank, that's across from the squatter camp. Also there, we established about 3,000 casualties. So we also always say this would have been the 13th of December 2002 would have been South Africa's 9/11 times 4. But we prevented it by 2 days.
So this time you've got all your suspects. There's nobody outstanding.
There was one guy outstanding. There was one guy outstanding. Also, the guy that we knew was not part of the bombing group, but we knew he was on the run. That is Vis Visagi. His wife was actually my daughter's maths teacher. But we arrested him in February after operation. But he was not involved in bombing. He was just on the run. By February, everybody was in custody, and we were starting with preparing for the trial.
I mean, we obviously don't have time to go into the whole trial, but I mean, you ended up with 23 accused people. It ended up taking, and I made some notes from Corin's book, 1,280 days in court. It cost 36 million rand. There were 53 bail applications. It's the longest trial we've ever had in South Africa.
That is so. I always compare it with Oscar Pretorius case that was televised live. Now, the people that followed that case, it felt like I turned ages and ages, but it took only 43 days. Now, 1,000 and something days, you compare it. We had to sit in court for that long period. And also now, because we were in court for so long, all the plans was there, and there was one successful escape from the court. Van Rooyen and Gous managed to escape from court during a trial, and they were evading us for 8 months. And then we rearrested them after 8 months, and they were back in court. And close to the end of the court case, there was another attempt by 5 of them to escape from court inside the court, and we also foiled that attempt. And only Van Rooyen managed to reach outside of the court building, but he was arrested then outside the court building and brought back to court. And eventually
chased down by a SAPS marathon runner, I believe.
So yes, that is Constable Nkosi was also. I watched him yesterday or Sunday on the Comrades. He's a Comrades runner, and so he's one of the fittest guys. He was posted outside exactly because of his fitness level and the speed that he had. And he and the car guards we became to know very well there in Church Square. They chased him down, and they arrested him right in front of the DPP's office there in Pretoria, in Church Square. Yes.
Look, I mean, as I said, we've summarized a lot, and I mean, and I think for people, read Corin's book. It goes into a lot of details about the trial, etc. I mean, that, as I said, we could spend days talking just about the trial, let alone the investigation. Paul, I mean, do you want to jump in with any other
No,
comments?
I just kind of wanted to just get a sense of just the top line to the end, and also, the story about the assassination attempt on Mandela as well. So maybe we could, because I almost feel like we should come back and do part 2, the trial.
Yes.
I think that's where we're standing, because I mean it's 9:30 right now, so well, like you say, we could go on talking for the rest of the evening about it, but maybe just the top line to the close. What was the top line to the end of the case, just for those folks watching, and then just tell us the story of the assassination attempt on Nelson Mandela, which I find to be a fascinating part of the story as well.
So unbeknown to us, there was assassination attempt, conspiracy to murder him. When as I said, Dion Kraus was one of the bombers, and he later turned state witness, and he told me about this plan that they had, an attempt that they had on killing Mandela, and on that same GPS that we found the coordinates of the farm. We found also the coordinates of a place in Bolobedu, close to Mujaji in Limpopo province. And Kraus described to me that it was on a day that Mandela was supposed to open a school there in Mujaji. Two of them went 2-3 days beforehand on the reconnaissance there, and they found that there was only one road leading to the school. And on that road leading to the school, there was a culvert. So they came back, they built a bomb of 65 kilograms. They went back and they placed it in the culvert. And they lay waiting for Mandela to cross with his convoy, cross the culvert, and will hand detonate to make sure that they detonate the right vehicle. They detonate the bomb underneath the right vehicle, correct vehicle, so that Mandela could be killed. But by the grace of God, on that day, Madiba was not feeling well, and they flew him with a chopper. He landed at the school. He opened the school, and he flew out, and he was taken back to his house. That is it. That is how. Now, if and let's be honest, if a white person killed Mandela, Gaza, as it today looks like, would have looked like a children's playground. Mm-hmm. South Africa would have looked like a children's playground in of what Gaza would. They would have been anarchy. There would have been a huge. And the judge mentioned it in his judgment. He said that you could have destroyed South Africa as a country itself by pushing that one button, killing, detonating one bomb underneath the icon of the world.
And they sat there for the kind of undetected for the day. Had Mandela's motorcade or gone on that route, likely they would have been successful.
They would have been successful. Yes, everything was there. They would have been successful.
Amazing.
That same bomb was later used in one of the Soweto bombings. Exactly the same.
Okay.
They just moved it. So all the particulars of parts of that bomb was used in one of the successful explosions in Soweto, yes.
Do I recall you said that they actually saw the chopper go over?
Yes. Yeah, they saw the chopper go over, and they said, I will not use the words that they said, but
a book.
Yes, yeah.
Just incredible. Okay, then should we just kind of try and get right to the end of the case, and then we'll take a couple of questions, and then we can wrap up for tonight. Like I say, I mean, Profile is not going anywhere, so we've got plenty of occasions that we can regroup and carry on this discussion and talk more in depth about the trial and about other cases as well. But maybe let's put a bow on tonight's conversation, Tolly.
Okay.
Yeah, perhaps the convictions, and then Gillian asks kind of what happened to them. Are they out now? So that would be a nice way to just
Okay, Gillian, I know you're going to ask that. So now all of them were convicted of treason. During the trial, two of them passed away of natural causes. A third one passed away just after the trial of natural causes. Actually, this accused 5, 10, and 15. That is, the 5 was played a role there. All of them were convicted of treason. The last 6 were convicted of culpable homicide on the death of Claudia Mokona, as well as conspiracy to commit murder for the attempt of murder on Madiba. They were sentenced in different sentences, from suspended sentences to the persons that is lesser involved, to lengthy imprisonment sentence of 35 years to the leadership. Mike de Tooy and Tom Foster and the bombers were sent to 35 years in prison. Cobus Pretorius, that showed remorse, was sentenced to 25 years. 10 years was suspended on all the sentences because they spent 10 years in custody awaiting trial. And to answer Gillian's Guaya's question is yes. The last Verhooyen and Gous were released in December of last year. They were released, and all of them are out. One of them, Giel Burger, accused number 7, died of natural causes in the meantime. He's also old. But the rest of them are integrated back into the community.
And I mean, are they, does anyone keep an eye on them?
I will pension. I hope so.
Okay.
Because they're still on parole. They're on parole.
That's how far I can take. Sorry, Gerard.
When you say they're released, I mean they're on parole. They're not.
They're
they haven't
parole.
finished their sentence. So they will be monitored in terms of parole conditions.
Yes. They're very they are on very strict parole conditions, and they have the correctional services have to monitor them according to their parole conditions. Yes.
Yeah. No bombs, no coups.
Hopefully not. But
Here you go. That's Just Criminal says, this needs to be made into a docu-series. Absolutely crazy and scary. What could have been a tragic part of our history? And that's absolutely the case. Quick question here. Can Tuli tell us about the wedding of one of the accused during the trial, and also the escape? So many interesting things happened. So there was a wedding mid-trial, was there?
yeah, there was actually quite a few weddings.
Okay.
Julian knows about the one wedding, accused number 18. Herman van Rooyen wanted to get married to his fiancée, and we arranged a wedding at the court in one of the offices there, where a preacher from Bella came, and he met them, and Van Rooyen was immediately taken back into the cells. But from the witnesses, two of them that was because a big part of this case was Section 204 witness, and we can speak in another stage about that. That was on the witness protection program. I had to marry two of them also, arrange marriages from there also, because they are conservatives. And they wanted to take their girlfriends with them in the witness protection, but the parents doesn't want them to live in sin. So they had to be, we had to arrange witness protection marriages also for them. So I was quite also a marriage, what do you call it? A wedding organizer, getting
wedding planner,
matchmaker,
wedding planner. Yes.
Lord. Are there any similar groups currently active in South Africa? Maybe this is a good place to wrap up. Is kind of what is the legacy of this case? And what are the chances of this kind of thing happening again, in your view, Tuli?
The Boeremark is gone forever. The right wing will never disappear. There will always be a next right wing group, and once they've been arrested, there will be a next one. And as long as our government continues with what's going on and allows people to, from open platforms, sing songs like Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer, the right wing will always exist. And that kind of stuff will fire the right wing. So no, the right wing threat will never go away. Not in this generation, not in the next generation. Maybe in a third generation from now on. But from up to then.
Yeah, I mean, we had 2019, the Crusaders, the Christian resistance movement. Harry Knudsen was a stupid plan, but a plan that would have caused a lot of harm to people and police and military people. It was in 2019, and I think that story just didn't really hit the news that much because it was November 2019, and we had COVID like 3 months later.
Yes.
But that's phenomenal. I mean, and again, the same kind of thing that likely hit. And there was a big use of like WhatsApp groups, Facebook, posting videos, even on YouTube. I mean, there was a big use of the social media stuff. Yeah.
Also, sorry, Tuli.
So in the Knudsen case, they made extensive use of social media. Some of the accused only met each other in court. They never met each other personally. They only were on social media friends, and they planned the whole coup on social media. But I said the right wing comes every 10 years because this group was in 2002. In 2012, we had the attempt on the ANC, the Mangaung group that we arrested 6 hours before the attack on the ANC elective conference. So then 2017 and 2019 again. And so yes, there's fixed periods between this kind of groups flaming up.
And it's something we talk about regularly is just, where we stand now from a policing point of view. You retired in the last couple of years, you've retired from SAPS. Do you still consult with the police? Do you still engage with them on cases? And who is there now? What do the eyeballs look like that are watching kind of local terrorism?
The problem with that is, the moment I went on retirement, my security clearance lapsed also. So I'm not privy to anything. Yeah, and all of this has to be, you have to have top secret security clearance. So I'm not privy. If they ask me for advice, I give them advice. What I do now is with my knowledge, I share it in Africa. I'm busy with a project in Eastern Africa with IAPCO, training the IAPCO police in counterterrorism investigation. South African police did not ask me yet to come and train them.
Bizarre. Absolutely bizarre. You'll be training other law enforcement agencies in South Africa want your advice, but not our local one.
Yeah. But are there good people there, Tolly? I mean,
Yes, there are still good people there.
Okay. And my last question is just, stepping away from kind of local terrorist groups, is South Africa a friendly environment for terrorists just generally from around the world?
Yes, we are. We are, especially our Islamic religious group, IS, and all those affiliates. My last part of my career I spent on those terrorist groups. That is, and I spent on the domestic branch as well as international links on that. Hence me being able to travel the world, because that is South Africa for now. That is why South Africa is currently grey-listed by the Financial Action Task Force, because of our lack of understanding and addressing terror financing. That is, South Africa is one of the origin of terror financing is big in South Africa, and that's why we're on the grey list by the United Nations.
Okay. All right. Well, that doesn't sound great, but at least we can talk about it and raise a bit of awareness so that folks watching can kind of understand a little bit of what the situation is here in South Africa. I guess we just have to be optimistic that, like you say, the folks that are there now are keeping their ear to the internet and to the ground as best as they possibly can. Jared, do you have any last questions or comments?
No, man, just as I said, this is just such a fascinating case. And there's so much more to it. And like I said, definitely, read Corin's book. And I 100% agree with someone who said this should be a multi-episode documentary series or dramatization. I don't think people will believe a lot of this stuff. It's so just phenomenal. But just thanks to you, Tolly. I know we didn't even get to touch on all the prosecutors, all the people in your team, the forensic people. I mean, there's so many people who played a role from the state side that are acknowledged in Corin's book. I think that was really great about her book. She really went great efforts to mention people by name. And just a thank you to you and your team and all those people that played this role and sacrificed so much of your own lives and your own anxieties and fears and safety to keep our country safe. And I'm very proud to call you my friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. Yeah, to emphasize, in this case, there's not a I. There's not a Tolly Vreugdenburg alone. There's a whole team, a huge team behind me. And without them, we wouldn't have been successful. I cannot take the fame on this case at all.
Well, I think everyone needs to go out immediately tomorrow morning, first thing.
Oh, we lost you, Paul. Yeah, and buy the book, High Treason Club by
Everyone
Karen
needs
Mitchell.
to, there we go. Everyone needs to get out and buy themselves a copy of the High Treason Club by Karen Mitchell. I mean, like I said, we've been at it for nearly 2 hours and we've just scratched the surface of all the kind of, all of the detail of the story. So get out there to your nearest bookseller, your exclusive books online, and get ordering. And please do support local true crime. We just got such incredible, fascinating stories to delve into, and this is very high at the top of the list, I would suggest. Tolly, thank you so much for taking the time to join us once again. We really appreciate it, and as always, we'd like to invite you back. Like I say, we're going to have to talk about some of the ups and downs of the trial at some point, and get into some other great cases as well, and some other great stories from your career, which spans such a long period of time. Maybe we can go get pre-Boeremark as well, back to kind of the murder and robbery unit days, some of the old war stories from back then.
You must ask Karen, she's busy with that, and putting it on paper.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so there you go. There's a tease for the follow-up, already lining up the next one. Thanks so much, guys. Any final comments from anyone before we say goodbye? Thanks to everyone for joining in the chat. As always, thank you for your contributions, for your super likes. We really appreciate you. It does help us to make this effort of ours sustainable. Thank you, Tolly. Thank you, Gerard. Good night. And I'm going to say good night to the two of you now, and then I will just sign off with everyone. So thanks, guys. And we'll chat again soon. See you again next week, Gerard.
Yes.
Go well. See you again.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay, guys. Well, a fascinating discussion there with Tolly. Do get off, get out, get your hands on the High Treason Club by Karen Mitchell. Incredible book there. There's Karen. Thank you so much, Paul, Jared, and Tolly. Greatly appreciate it. Well, it's our pleasure. You know, we love diving into these stories. Guys, the only other thing I wanted to say to you is that on Thursday, we will be dropping the next episode of South African Serial. We've got a very interesting case lined up for you. The PE prostitute killer, a case of two murders. And the only thing I can say to you is a bit of advice before you watch is, you know, if you're going to murder somebody, maybe don't dispose of the body in the back garden of the house that you rent on a property that belongs to somebody else. I'm going to leave you tonight, folks, with a clip from this week's episode of South African Serial. Like I say, it's going to be live for everybody at 8 a.m. on Thursday. Thank you so much for watching. If you're listening on one of the podcast platforms, thank you so much for listening. And we'll see you again next week on Profiler Africa. Good night.
The bodies of two sex workers were found days apart, about 432 meters from each other.
Being a police officer in Port Elizabeth does have challenges. The trade of drugs, sex work, taverns emanating in the area.
The only forensic evidence is the body.
And her body was found with a gaping wound to the neck.
The concerns would be that we have a serial murderer active.
And if immediately the bells started ringing.
There was a clear incised wound of about 26 centimeters long from ear to ear.
Nobody deserves to die that way.
I am a human being and I kill human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.